My name's Helen. I'm your run-of-the-mill 30-year-old economist living a life as ordinary as the next person. You wouldn't pick me out of a crowd. Average height, average weight, brown hair, brown eyes. I'm as regular as they come. I've always been a wallflower in the world of romance, never quite stepping into the spotlight. Men never seemed to find me particularly captivating, and to be honest, I didn't mind. I had my job at a big company, my ever-growing collection of books, and my small but tight-knit group of friends to keep me company. One day, my friends who were more outgoing than I could ever hope to be, decided that I needed to get out more. "Helen, you've got to get out of that shell of yours," they'd said. And despite my protests, I found myself agreeing. So I went, fully expecting to spend the evening tucked away in a corner with a glass of wine for company. At the party, amidst the cacophony of loud music and louder conversations, I noticed a tall figure weaving his way through the crowd towards me. It was a man, and not just any man. This guy was the kind of handsome that made you do a double take. His name was Ryan, and he had a certain charisma about him that was hard to ignore. I was surprised when he approached me. Men like him didn't usually notice women like me. "Hey, mind if I crash here?" he asked, pointing to the vacant chair next to me. His voice was deep, and his tone was casual, like we'd been buddies for years. I looked around, thinking he must have mistaken me for someone else. "Me?" I asked, pointing to myself. He let out a hearty laugh that somehow managed to rise above the party's noise. "Yeah, you. You ain't holding this seat for some knight in shining armor, are you?" "No, not at all," I replied, still taken aback by his forwardness. "Please have a seat." And so he did. We started chatting, and I was taken aback by how easily the conversation flowed. He was an engineer, had an odd fondness for 19th century literature, and his sense of humor was as dry as a bone. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being seen. "Helen, can I ask you something?" he asked a couple of hours into our conversation. "Sure, Ryan, what's on your mind?" "Why are you single? I mean, you're intelligent, you've got a wicked sense of humor, and you're not half bad to look at." "Yeah, don't give me that look." "You're a catch," he said as I started to protest. I blushed, not used to such compliments. "I guess I haven't found the right guy yet." I gave him a knowing smile. "Well, maybe your luck's about to turn." We exchanged numbers that night, and he called me the very next day, asking me out. I said yes. Ryan and I were like two peas in a pod. We hit it off right from the get-go and soon found ourselves in a whirlwind romance. He was attentive, remembered the little things that mattered to me, like how I liked my coffee black with 2 sugars, or that I preferred scrambled eggs over fried. He even remembered the names of all the characters from my favorite book series, which was no small feat. I was falling for him, and falling hard. One day, he decided it was time for me to meet his folks. His mom, Martha, was as sweet as pie, and his dad, George, was a quiet man who let his actions do the talking. Their house was a cozy little place filled with pictures of Ryan from his childhood to his graduation. It was clear they were proud of their boy. "Helen, you've snagged yourself a good one," Martha said, patting my hand. "We're glad our boy found you." George, a man of few words, just nodded in agreement. "You look after him, and he'll do the same for you." Their words touched me, and I felt a sense of belonging. It was like I'd been a part of their family all along. A few months into our relationship, Ryan threw me for a loop. We were having dinner at our favorite restaurant when he suddenly got down on one knee. "Helen, will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes filled with hope. I was taken aback. We hadn't been dating for long, but it felt right. I looked into his eyes and saw a future I wanted to be a part of. Yes, Ryan, I'll marry you. Our wedding was a simple affair, just the way I liked it. We didn't need a big, fancy shindig. We just needed each other. My dad was over the moon. He took to Ryan like a duck to water and was thrilled to see his little girl so happy. "You've done good, Helen," he said, giving Ryan a hearty pat on the back. "Look after my girl." "I will, sir," Ryan replied, a serious look on his face. The wedding was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. I was never the type to dream about a big white wedding, but I found myself loving every minute of it. The dress, the flowers, the vows. It was all perfect. I felt beautiful, loved, and happier than I'd ever been. I was marrying the man I loved, and I couldn't wait to start our life together. As we were leaving the church hand in hand, Ryan turned to me and said, "Helen, I've been thinking. I want us to move in with my folks. They ain't getting any younger, and they could use our help." I was surprised, but I agreed. I liked Martha and George, and I wanted to do my part. I was ready to start this new chapter of our lives. Little did I know, things were about to take a turn I never saw coming. We packed up our stuff and moved into Ryan's parents' old house. The place was ancient, a relic from another era, and it showed. The paint was peeling off the walls, the floors creaked with every step, and the roof leaked when it rained. But it was home, Ryan's childhood home, and now it was ours. Martha and George were over the moon to have us. They showered us with love and affection, so much so that it sometimes felt like they were laying it on a bit thick. But I shrugged it off, figuring they were just happy to have us around. "Darn good to have you here, Helen," George would say, clapping me on the shoulder with a grin. "The house has been too quiet without you." Martha, always the doting mother, would fuss over us, making sure we were comfortable and had everything we needed. "You two just make yourselves at home," she'd say, bustling around the kitchen. "This is your home now, too." I was touched by their warmth and generosity, even if it did feel a bit over the top at times. I felt like I was part of their family, and I was excited about starting this new chapter of our lives. But then, a few weeks into our stay, Ryan dropped a bombshell. We were sitting at the dinner table, picking at our food, when he cleared his throat and said, "Helen, we need to talk." I looked up, surprised. Ryan was usually so easygoing, so laid back. To see him so serious was unsettling. "What's up?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "The house needs repairs, Helen. Serious repairs. The roof, the plumbing, the wiring, it's all shot. Mom and Dad can't afford to fix it." I was taken aback. I knew the house was old, but I didn't realize it was in such bad shape. "So what do we do?" I asked, my mind racing. Ryan looked at me, his eyes pleading. I was thinking maybe we could help. Use my salary and part of your savings to pay for the repairs. I was floored. My savings were meant for our future, for a house of our own, for our kids' education. To spend it on fixing up Ryan's parents' house, it was a lot to ask. But then Martha started crying, and George looked at me with such hope in his eyes. I couldn't say no. So I agreed. I agreed to use my savings to fix up the house. It was a tough decision, one that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. But I did it for Ryan, for Martha and George. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The moment the renovations on the old house kicked off, the bills started rolling in like an avalanche. Every damn day, there was a new expense, another problem that needed fixing. The roof was leaking, the plumbing was shot, the wiring was a fire hazard. The costs were piling up faster than a snowdrift in a blizzard. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of dealing with contractors and arguing over bills, Ryan and I sat down at the kitchen table, our heads in our hands. The burden of our financial troubles was bearing down on us like a 2-ton weight, and we were both feeling the strain. "Helen, we're in deep," Ryan said, his voice heavy with worry. "These damn repairs, they're sucking us dry. We can't keep this up." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I know, Ryan, I know, but what choice do we have? We can't just stop now. The house is a wreck. It's not safe for your folks." Ryan nodded and then dropped another bombshell. "Helen, there's something else," he said, avoiding my gaze. "I've been demoted at work. My pay's been slashed. I can't put in as much for the repairs as we planned." I was floored. "What? When the hell were you going to tell me this, Ryan?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "I didn't want to stress you out more," he said, finally meeting my gaze. "I thought I could handle it." "Well, you thought wrong," I snapped, my anger flaring up. "Now what are we going to do?" We were in a real tight spot. My savings were dwindling, the bills were piling up, and now Ryan was pulling back on his share. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. Martha and George, Ryan's folks, were worried too. They could see the stress etched on our faces, hear the worry in our voices. They felt guilty, I could tell. They didn't want to be a burden, but they didn't know how to help. One evening, after yet another heated discussion about money, George pulled me aside. "Helen," he said, his voice gruff, "I want you to know we appreciate everything you're doing for us. We know it's hard on you." I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. "George, it's not your fault. We want to help. We just didn't realize how much it would cost." George nodded, his eyes sad. "I know, Helen. I know, and we're grateful. But we don't want you two to ruin yourselves over this. It's not worth it." I hugged him, tears streaming down my face. "George, you're family. You're worth it." Despite the financial strain, despite the stress and worry, I didn't regret our decision. We were helping Martha and George, and that was what mattered. Money was tight, yes, and times were tough, but we were doing the right thing. We were taking care of our family, and that was priceless. In the end, we managed to scrape by. We tightened our belts, cut back on our expenses, and did everything we could to save money. It was hard, but we made it work. We finished the repairs, and the house was safe and comfortable once more. To celebrate, my in-laws, Martha and George, threw a fancy dinner. The food was great, the wine was flowing, and everyone was in high spirits. But then, out of nowhere, Martha started sobbing, her tears falling onto the white linen tablecloth. "We've done something terrible," she sobbed. Her voice choked with emotion. "We mortgaged the house. 200 grand. We have 2 months to pay it back, or we lose everything." The room plunged into stunned silence. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, obscuring the joy and mirth that had filled the room just moments ago. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the magnitude of the situation sinking in. 200 grand, the number seemed astronomical, a figure so large it was hard to comprehend. "Why would you do something like that?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible over the deafening silence. The question hung in the air unanswered as Martha continued to sob inconsolably. George finally spoke. "We didn't have a choice, dear," he said, his voice somber. "Some years ago, I got into a difficult situation. It was a matter of life or death. We thought we could handle it, but we were wrong." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, I turned to my husband, Ryan, seeking some form of reassurance. But he just sat there, his face as white as the pristine tablecloth, his eyes wide with shock. "We're screwed," he finally muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't pay that back. Not in 2 months." Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Ryan's demeanor changed. His shock gave way to a cunning glint in his eyes. "Your dad could help us out, right, Helen?" he said. "He's got money." I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. "You want me to ask my dad for money?" I asked incredulously. "That's your solution?" Ryan's face hardened, his eyes cold and calculating. "Why not? He's got more than enough. He wouldn't even miss it." "I can't believe you're suggesting this," I retorted, my temper flaring. "My dad worked hard for his money. It's not our place to ask him for help." Suddenly, Martha and George were on Ryan's side, their faces morphing from loving parents into stern accusers. "Don't you care about us, Helen?" Martha asked, her voice filled with disappointment. "Don't you want to help us?" The pressure was immense. I felt cornered, trapped. "Of course I care, but—" My voice trailed off. "But nothing," Ryan interrupted, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You either help us or you don't. It's as simple as that." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I was being manipulated, coerced into making a decision I didn't want to make. But in the face of their relentless pressure, I saw no other choice. "Fine," I conceded, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll ask my dad." A wave of relief washed over Ryan's face. "Thank you, Helen. You're saving us." But I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like a pawn in a cruel game of chess, maneuvered and manipulated at will. As I looked around the room at the faces of my new family, a pang of regret pierced my heart. What had I gotten myself into? The night that was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for us. I remember the day as if it was yesterday. I was sitting across from my father, asking for a favor. I needed to borrow money to pay off my in-laws' debt. His eyes, usually full of warmth, were serious as he listened to my plea. "I'll lend them the money, Helen," he said after a long silence. "But only if Ryan signs a receipt." I was taken aback. A receipt? It seemed so formal, so cold. But I understood his reasoning. He was a businessman, after all. He believed in doing things the right way, in black and white. Ryan, however, was clearly unhappy with this decision. He grumbled and complained, but eventually agreed. He borrowed $200,000 from my father, against a receipt drawn up according to all the rules. The money was used to pay off his parents' debt for the house. And then, just as we thought things were getting better, tragedy struck. My father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. I was devastated. I had lost my rock, my support system. I had to prepare for his funeral, all while dealing with the shock and grief of his sudden passing. It was a challenging time, to say the least. One day, I returned home earlier than usual. I needed a break from the funeral preparations, from the condolences, from the sea of sorrowful faces. As I walked in, I heard voices coming from the living room. It was Ryan, Martha, and George. They were talking, their voices low and hushed. I quietly walked towards the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood behind the door, listening to their conversation. They were talking about me, about the money, about the receipt. "We've done it, Ryan," I heard George say, his voice filled with glee. "We've fooled her. We've gotten the money to repair the house and pay off the debts." "I'm tired, Dad," Ryan replied, his voice full of disgust. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of living with her. I want a divorce." "But what about the receipt, Ryan?" Martha asked, her voice stern and commanding. "We need to get rid of it first," Ryan assured her confidently. "Only then can you divorce her." "Don't worry, Mom," Ryan said confidently. "I'll take care of it. I'll steal the receipt and destroy it." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had planned this all along. They had used me, betrayed me, and now they were planning to get rid of me. I slammed the front door, pretending I had just arrived. I put on a brave face, pretending everything was fine. "Helen, dear, how are the funeral preparations going?" Martha asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. "They're going well, Martha," I replied, my voice steady. "Thank you for asking." And with that, I walked away, my mind racing. I needed to figure out my next move. I needed to protect myself, to fight back. Over the next few days, I put on a brave face. I smiled, I laughed, I played the dutiful daughter-in-law. But inside, I was seething. I was hurt, I was angry, and I was determined to make them pay. The day of my father's funeral was a blur of tears and condolences, a whirlwind of sadness that left me drained. But as the last of the mourners left and the sun began to set, the real storm was only beginning. Back at the house, Ryan, his parents, Martha, and George, and I gathered in the living room. The air was thick with unspoken words, the silence only broken by the occasional clink of ice against glass as Ryan swirled his drink. I watched them from the corner of my eye, their faces a mask of sympathy and concern. But I knew better. Suddenly, Ryan broke the silence. "Helen," he said, his voice cold and hard, "you need to leave." I turned to him, feigning surprise. "What?" I asked, my voice shaky. "You heard me," he said, his voice even colder. "You need to leave. This is my parents' house, and you're not welcome here anymore." Martha and George nodded in agreement, their faces hard. "We've put up with you for long enough, Helen," Martha said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "But we don't need you anymore." "And what about the house?" I asked, pretending to be shocked. "The money I lent you for the house." Martha laughed, a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed around the room. "This house," she scoffed. "This house is ours, Helen, and you have no place here." Ryan joined in her laughter, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "And about that money, Helen," he said, his voice filled with mockery. "I found those receipts at your father's house, and I destroyed them." His words hung in the air, a declaration of his deceit. But instead of breaking down, instead of giving in to despair, I did something unexpected. I laughed. My laughter filled the room, a stark contrast to the heavy silence. Ryan, Martha, and George stared at me, their faces a picture of shock and confusion. You knew." Ryan stammered, his face pale. I nodded, my laughter subsiding. "I knew," I said, my voice steady. "I knew about your plans, about your deceit." But the receipts," George stammered, his face pale. "We destroyed them." I shook my head, a smile playing on my lips. "Those were just copies, George," I said calmly. "The real ones are with my lawyer." Ryan and George exchanged a glance, their faces pale. I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew they were cornered. Do you want the money back?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. "I want it back, Ryan," I said firmly. "And I want it now. Otherwise, I'm going to the police." Ryan and George paled even more, their eyes wide with fear. "Helen, please," George pleaded. We can work something out." I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. "No, George," I said firmly. "You had your chance. Now it's time to pay." After a long silence, Ryan finally spoke. We give you the house," he said, his voice shaky, "in exchange for the IOUs." I nodded, satisfied. "Good," I said calmly. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers." And with that, I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. I had done it. I had confronted them. I had exposed their deceit. I had won. A few weeks later, I watched from the window as Ryan and his parents packed their belongings into a moving van. They were leaving their home, their house, my house now. I couldn't help but smile as I watched them drive away, their faces a picture of defeat. I was free, free from their manipulation, free from their deceit. I had won. I had taken back control of my life. And as I closed the door to my new house, I knew that I was finally ready to move on, to start a new chapter in my life. So as the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I sat down in my new living room, a sense of peace washing over me. I had faced my fears. I had stood up for myself. I had won. I was stronger than I had ever been. I was a survivor, a fighter, and I was ready for whatever came next.